Corruption, murder and intrigue. Flamboyant politician Bo Xilai heads to the courts in a scandal that has divided China. His spectacular downfall exposes the messy infighting in the highest echelon of politics. How will the Communist Party wrap up the scandal, and what does this mean for the country's transparency and Bo's future? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. His case lifted the lid on the inner workings of the secretive Communist Party and exposed a rift between some of its members. Bo Xilai was a charismatic and popular leader who looked set to join the upper ranks of China's ruling party. But that was before a murder scandal involving his wife and a former police chief brought about his downfall. Now Bo is set to appear in public for the first time in 17 months. He'll be facing charges of bribery, corruption and abuse of power. Harry Fawcett has more.
Bo Xilai's last public appearance was as a member of the Communist Party's Politburo at the National People's Congress in Beijing in March last year. That his next should be as an accused criminal in a courtroom in a provincial city exemplifies a stunning fall from grace. The son of a leading revolutionary, he served as mayor of the northeastern city of Dalian and as China's commerce minister. But the scandal that would bring him down came years later, when he was party secretary of the southwestern city of Chongqing. In November 2011, the British businessman Neil Haywood was found dead in a hotel room there. An associate of Bo and his wife, Bo Xilai, his death would eventually come to be seen as murder, after Bo's trusted police chief, Wang Lijun, fled to a nearby US consulate with an extraordinary account of Haywood's killing. At her trial last year, Bo Xilai admitted poisoning Haywood and was given a suspended death sentence. Now Chongqing, a place once synonymous with the man, is being cleansed of his traces.
You really don't have to look too hard to find ways that Bo's legacy is quietly being expunged in this city. In this park, just across the road from his old office, is where people used to gather to sing red songs, part of his signature drive to rekindle a communal Maoist spirit. Instead, now, we find a sign saying such singing is considered too noisy.
A once high-profile police presence is now substantially more relaxed. It's harder to wipe out his more concrete legacy, like the social housing that won him support among the poor.
He was a good leader. I hope he doesn't get punished too severely.
Support extends to many still within the upper reaches of the party, which is why some believe he'll get a relatively light sentence of 20 years.
The Communist Party is a huge organization, and this bickering amongst the factions will always be there. It's just that for the sake of party unity, I think Xi Jinping has settled for a lenient treatment for his major political rival.
His career over, a life at best under house arrest in store, there are some determined not to let this one-time star of Chinese politics slip silently away. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, Chongqing, China.
Let's flesh this topic out more with my guests, three of them. From Beijing, Victor Gao, Director of China National Association of International Studies. He previously worked in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From London, Roderic Wye, Associate Fellow, Asia Programme at Chatham House. And from Nottingham, Steve Tsang, Director of China Policy Institute at the University of Nottingham. Tell us, Victor Gao, what is the narrative, the chatter, if you like, in China right now about this case?
I think the public trial of Bo Xilai will attract a lot of attention among the Chinese people. After all, Bo Xilai is a highly controversial figure. While the government tries its best to pin him down on corruption, taking bribery and abuse of power, there are actually lots of people who still think highly of some of the public political initiatives that he launched in Chongqing city. Therefore, I think the people will most likely watch this very carefully and try to see what kind of sentence he will get and whether the government is dealing with the corruption as it is or whether some of the political considerations, the background of this case will also need to be addressed.
So clearly a very important
It will be a milestone case in China.
Sure. Tell us how it's going to play out. What are you hearing? I mean, we are hearing that he's probably going to plead guilty. Is that correct?
Now, I think this case will be a milestone case. After all, Bo Xilai is the third member of the Politburo in China to stand such trial in more than 20 years. And therefore, in addition to a lot of public scrutiny, I think people will need to watch very carefully as to what Bo Xilai will say in the trial and whether he will indeed plead guilty or not. After all, in the Chinese circumstances as it stands now, I think there is no doubt about the final outcome of this case. It will be a guilty case and he will get a sentence. And my judgment, he most likely will get a sentence up to about 13 or 15 or even up to about 18 years. I don't think death sentence will apply or death sentence with probation will apply in this particular case. But I think the focus of the attention among many people in China will be whether this is purely a crime case or whether this is a political motivated case. So I think on this particular point, the government needs to deal with this case very carefully and to avoid any repercussion or long-term implications down the road.
Okay, Steve Tsang, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Is he a guilty man, a victim, or a bit of both?
Well, the Bo Xilai case is a very important one for the Chinese leadership because Bo Xilai was somebody who was expected to rise to become one of them amongst the top 7 most powerful people, and he was brought down just before Bo Xilai was able to get there. So in that sense, it's terribly important, and for that reason, I think the whole trial will already has its script written up. Everything would have been agreed to and approved of by the top leadership before the actual trial.
In your mind, the charges that he's facing, what is the most damaging?
Well, the charges individually, it will really depend on what they actually are detailed out in specifics. The corruption charges is carefully calibrated. It's a major corruption case, but it's nowhere near what most people in China or outside of China would expect somebody like Bo Xilai to be involved in. The idea that he's been charged for corruption in Dalian, but not in Chongqing, where he was much more powerful, just beggars belief. So it will be more in terms of the abuse of office that will be the serious one. But again, it depends on how they want to write that script of what abuse of office he would be charged against.
Roderic Wye, you've lived and worked there. What do you make of this case and the goings-on?
Well, as far as what is going to happen, I agree with Steve. It's a very carefully worked out script. It's going to be a couple of days trial and then there's going to be a period of quietness before the inevitable sentence is announced. I don't think we're going to get much new information out of this process. What we will get is the story that the Chinese government wishes to know about why, in their view, Bo Xilai had to fall.
So you don't think we're going to learn any more about the party?
I don't think we are. The party has already closed ranks on this case. This is the final act in a long, drawn-out process, and the decisions and the consequences of those decisions have already been worked through in the Chinese system. So I don't see that I don't think we're going to get anything very much new. We're not going to really understand quite why it is that Bo Xilai fell. We are not going to understand exactly what it is that he did. There will be a list of charges and crimes and these kind of things, but they will not be, I agree again with Steve, they will not really be credible.
Victor, the location is in Jinan. This is so often the case, isn't it, when somebody is a high-profile person heading to courts, that it's put in a place where he or she might not necessarily be popular. Do you think that's going to work?
Yes, I think the choice of Jinan as the place for the trial is important. I think the rule of thumb consideration in China is to avoid any place or any province where the defendant has a strong connection or where he may have some conflict of interest. Therefore, I think the authorities have come to the conclusion that Jinan, or the court system in Jinan, has the lowest amount of possible conflict of interest in this particular case. They are more independent, and Bo Xilai and his people do not have a lot of influence over there. So they think by choosing Jinan, a more fair and equitable and transparent trial can be conducted. But I think given the Chinese nature of the rule of law here, this trial is not the beginning of the process. It is most likely the last chapter of a long, prolonged process. And I think the party in China has already made up their mind. They have already made their own party decision. And the prosecutor's office have already had a long, drawn-out, highly exhaustive process. And I think the public trial is basically the last nail into this whole chapter. And I think no one will be surprised by the process or the procedure or the final outcome of this trial.
But
as I said,
possibly angered, Victor. Sorry, let me just jump in here.
Aspirations.
Sure. There were some professional petitioners outside the court already, and this is what our correspondent was telling me. And they were saying that if an elite person can't get a fair trial, what hope for the others? That's an important question, isn't it?
Well, of course, in China right now, the freedom of speech is actually very much encouraged. So different people have different views on this one. However, I would say that while many people in China still think there are political considerations underlining this case, the authority definitely want to treat this case as purely a crime case, a violation, abuse, and corruption, and nothing more. So they are not going to talk about any political connection to this case. And I think by the end of the day, Bo Xilai will need to fall, and those who strongly follow his line of political thinking will need to be dealt with very effectively, and China need to turn a new page, and the new leadership in China need to really start anew, leading China in a new direction, which will be very different from what Bo Xilai wanted to do by becoming a more senior leader in China.
Okay, you raised 2 points there, which I'm going to put to you, Steve. The justice system and the way it works. I mean, it is basically under the Communist Party. And Victor was saying that freedom of speech is encouraged in the country. Is that true?
Freedom of speech is encouraged in China. I think that really is a very bold statement. I think if you're talking about freedom of speech in terms of fashion, in terms of what to wear and where to eat, yes, you have absolute freedom of that. If it's a matter of dealing with really sensitive, touchy political issues, I think that is a different matter. Constitutionalism as an idea is at the moment under attack through the leadership of the very top of the Chinese government. And so I think that tells us a lot about freedom of speech. But in terms of justice being delivered to individuals, we have to bear in mind that in this situation in China, the more senior it is, the less chance you have to get a fair trial in something like this. It's all politics. It's not about justice.
Roderic, why do you think he wasn't sent out of the country? That seemed to be the modus operandi in the past. I was reading about one dissident who'd been sent out of the country, and he said it's like cutting off your legs and putting you in a wheelchair. You effectively lose your influence. Wouldn't that have been more effective?
That does not happen. That happens with dissidents, that they have been sent out of the country from time to time. It does not happen with fallen political leaders, because that would allow them the opportunity actually to reveal what happened, and a lot more of the inside story than we are ever going to get. So that was never on the cards that Mr. Bo would be sent into exile from China.
Let's talk a little bit more about the man who's causing all this drama. Before his dramatic downfall, Bo Xilai was a rising star in the Communist Party. He's, as said earlier, the son of former Vice Premier Bo Xilai, one of the founders of the ruling party. And before he was ousted, Bo Xilai was the party chief in the southwestern city of Chongqing. It was there that he made a name for himself, overseeing economic growth and social projects that made him hugely popular with the city's 30 million residents. His state-led economic policy even became known as the Chongqing model, and it won him a lot of supporters among the left of the Communist Party. Bo's populist and sometimes flamboyant style was seen as a liability by some, but the decision to remove him from the party has exposed a deep rift among party leaders, rarely seen in public. Victor, rather, it's interesting, isn't it, that this man had such an impact on the areas that he governed, that the government has been so frightened, as our correspondent was telling us earlier, that they've basically removed all sign of the achievements that he made. Why is that?
Well, it's very obvious that Bo Xilai was a very unconventional Chinese political leader. You know, his style was different, his substance was different, his way of dealing with the international media was different. He was a man of his own words, and he was also a doer. He actually launched many initiatives which are highly popular in the city of Chongqing. And he was way out of line with the other leaders in his generation in terms of the way they present themselves and engage with the people. So in this sense, I think Bo Xilai was more in line with a typical politician in the Western country. And he could have done very successfully in a Western country if he were operating in that particular country. As a result of that, there are still people in China who believe that the case was politically motivated. And I think that is exactly the reason why the government wants to focus on the crime and the abuse of power and the corruption and the bribery cases, so that no one will be able to say that Bo Xilai will not deserve the sentence he eventually will get, because the facts that the government, the authority will reveal and make public will be sufficient enough to give him the sentence that eventually he will get. Okay. That's the hope of the authority, to really pin him down on the violations and the abuse and all these criminal things,
okay,
so
Roderic,
that no one will ever try to reopen the case.
It seems to me that there's an ideological struggle happening not only within the party but within China itself.
There is. I mean, there's a great debate about how the future of China should be seen. But I think as far as Mr. Bo's contribution to all that is concerned, this is all something of the past now. And what we are seeing is an attempt to erase his political memory and, as Victor said, to translate what he did into a series of alleged criminal acts, distancing him from the political processes and the political debates in China, so that Mr. Bo and his views no longer have any influence on the way that the debate is going.
Do you think that's going to be successful, Steve? Is this going to have an impact on the political debates underway in China? And are these political debates not really important now, considering that the economy, for example, is struggling?
The Chinese situation is that everybody needs to reform. There are differences in terms of how to do it, but the biggest difference is really in terms of how drastic they are going to make those changes. I don't think Bo Xilai really was all that out of line in terms of the actual policies compared to that of the rest of the Communist Party, but the way he did it was different, and that caused a bit of a problem. Having removed Bo Xilai, I think the new leadership under Xi Jinping wants to project an image that it actually is able to grab the bull by the horns, as it were, and get on with things. But that doesn't necessarily means that they will be able to implement the economic and other reforms that are necessary in China to rebalance the economy and to keep the Communist Party in power for the next 10, 20 years. That, I think, remains to be seen.
What's bubbling under here, obviously, is the huge corruption issue that the country faces. And I'd like to bring up another corruption case, Liu Tinan, Steve, where people are naming and shaming individuals online, and the party is having to respond to this. Is that quite an effective way of showing them up?
Well, the party is managing corruption in a very careful way. Corruption is a very serious problem. The party recognized that Xi Jinping made it into one of his first major missions after he came to power. But of course, we also know through investigative journalism by some audacious American journalists that Xi Jinping's family, not Xi Jinping himself, but his family is so incredibly wealthy that there are questions about how that wealth were being accumulated. And that same question applies to practically everybody in the top leadership in China. So they cannot really deal with corruption head-on in a way that will eradicate corruption, because it means basically sacking every one of them. So they have to specifically identify specific problems and say this is the level of corruption that we have seen and this is the one we're dealing with. And we see this in how they deal with Bo Xilai's case, simply limiting his corruption charges to that in Dalian, but not in Chongqing.
Roderic, I mean, if corruption is so endemic, I guess it's the question of how you balance this anti-corruption drive with the domino effect it's likely to have.
Yes, and it goes to how the party rules in China. I think what we are going to see is, as what we've seen in other similar campaigns against corruption, that there will be a number of high-profile names who are uncovered one way or another, either by sort of individuals or by the state, and they will be duly dealt with. Mr. Bo Xilai's case, which predates this anti-corruption campaign, will somehow be incorporated into it to show that no top leader is even the highest are vulnerable to this anti-corruption campaign. But I wouldn't expect any other very senior leaders to be involved unless there were another outbreak of factional political infighting in the top leadership, and that I think is unlikely for the present.
Victor, are people losing faith in the Communist Party, or do you think that's why we're seeing the case happen now, that this is one way of the Communist Party's reclaiming its lost ground?
I think, first of all, corruption is rampant in China, and it is a great challenge for the government and for the party as to how to effectively deal with that. And I think people are becoming more and more cynical about the scale and the scope and the intensity of the corruption. A few people are ever more surprised as to, for example, whether Liu Tianan or other people in high positions can be as corrupt as they are. However, calling people losing faith in the party is a little bit of too much of an exaggeration, mainly because despite all this corruption, the party is still very much focused on promoting economic growth, and the people's living standards are improving. And I think so long as that continues, people will not be happy with the corruption, but they will be able to get along with the political situation. So it becomes a race against time. On the one hand, the government needs to do whatever they can to weed out corruption, to head along, deal with corruption as is, and do not hide away from this reality.
Roderic, do you think that will continue if this one-party state continues to be in power, which it seems it will be for a long time to come? I know it's hard to predict what can happen in China.
At the moment, yes, the one-party state, it looks like going to continue. But I think Victor has put his finger on a very important point, and that is a lot of the party's legitimacy now depends on its ability to continue to provide a high level of economic success. And that, I think, is becoming more and more questionable. And as Steve said, they need now to turn to real fundamental reform of the economic system to provide that. And that, of course, will have serious repercussions throughout the system, including political repercussions.
Because I should imagine that all of this is also having quite an impact, Steve, on China's profile to the rest of the world and its standing.
Well, it does have an impact on China's standing and profile, but Xi Jinping is not really so worried about that. He is more keen to project a China under him which is very much China-centric, China-focused, and very proud of Chinese tradition. And he is, in a sense, trying to fuse what remains of the communist system and some of the Maoist ideas that he himself shared with Bo Xilai and dress them up as essentially Chinese characteristics, and say that the Chinese people have their own particular way of development, that China should not slavishly follow the path of the Western world, and China should be proud of the Chinese way, which will be successful. That will be his narrative.
All right, let's leave it on that note. Thank you very much to my guests, Victor Gao, Roderic Wye and Steve Tsang. Fascinating conversation. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, please email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.com. Thanks again for watching. From me, Jane Dutton, and the team, goodbye.